Thank you, Colonel Hershey, and thank you and a warm welcome to all of you here, to our organizers. Thank you to our hosts, AUSA, our panelists, and thank you for those who have tuned in and are joining us on the web. You can't do that with pagers, I hear. So the purpose of the first panel is to address the central elements of NATO's projecting stability agenda and how key leaders view the concept and its implementation today. We are some 2 years after the agreed concept that if NATO's neighbors are more stable, NATO is more secure. We saw that in Warsaw in 2016, and it is appropriate, following the Brussels summit in July, to take stock, to assess priorities, gauge long-term stability commitments with some of the shorter-term policy and funding realities that we face. So I'm Richard Love at the Army War College. I'm going to help to moderate the panel and facilitate what is no doubt going to be a probative and thoughtful question and answer period. So in order to make the most of the time we have today, I'll first introduce our panelists in the order in which they will speak, then turn to each for their remarks. Please hold your questions until all 4 of our panelists have spoken. This will allow all the panelists to comment on the range of questions we'll no doubtedly have after all of them have made their remarks. So to help us to understand projecting stability, how it is understood, and its relationship with other NATO core interests, we have 4 outstanding leaders to provide their thoughts and their insights. First, it's an honor to introduce James Appathurai, the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Security Policy. He is also the Secretary General's Special Representative for the Caucasus and Central Asia. His many areas of responsibility include charting NATO's political relations with countries across the globe and providing policy advice on political issues affecting the security of the alliance. He is also responsible for the strategically important regions of the Caucasus and Central Asia. Welcome, Jim. Thank you for making time. It's great to have you here this morning, and look forward to getting your thoughts from the kind of leadership perspective on NATO projecting stability. Let me next introduce Lieutenant General Michael Nagata, the Director of the Directorate of Strategic Operational Planning at the National Counterterrorism Center. General Nagata will help us understand how Europe and NATO's near abroad is experiencing uneven but quite real growth in violent extremism and the impacts that has for NATO and European policies. Welcome, General, and thank you for making time for us this morning. Next up, Mark E. Mitchell, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict, former Director of Counterterrorism at the NSC. Mr. Mitchell will address projecting stability from the policy and special operations context. Welcome, Mr. Mitchell. Honored to have you on the panel. Anchoring the scene-setting panel is Major General William B. Hickman. He is the Director of Strategic Plans and Policy for NATO Allied Transformation Command. General Hickman will base his remarks on projecting stability from a few central core documents. The strategic FourSided Analysis that was conducted in 2017 and the framework for future alliance operations this year. Perhaps we'll also get some key themes from some of the military concepts on projecting stability as well. So welcome, Major General Hickman. Great to have you here. This was just a short introduction, so more comprehensive biographical information is available in your packages. I encourage you to take a look at those and refer to that for a deeper appreciation of this truly remarkable expert panel we have to kind of set the scene here this morning. Finally, let me remind the panelists and the audience alike that since we are broadcasting live, to please use the microphones, and that includes for any questions and answers. We'd like to try to capture that so those joining us online can also hear the questions as well. So thank you, and to get us started, Jim, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a great honor and pleasure I really believe that what this group does is part of a larger team effort that we are all engaged in, and so I really welcome the opportunity to share some thoughts. I will have to share some personal thoughts because the Deputy Secretary General has basically done exactly what I had intended to do. What I'd like to do then, and recognizing that this is being, webcast, is give you my some personal reflections on this issue, which I hope will help, because I do believe that we can do better, and I share the view of the moderator and the Deputy Secretary General that what we need coming out of this discussion with this group of decision makers in one room is to have some follow-up actions. So I'd like to just put some thoughts on the table about what NATO is doing, what it can do, and where we can do better. And I'll just start with the question that you had sent us, Richard, where it talked about overcoming the challenges involved with stability operations. So I reflected on the way over here about what the challenges are from my experience, and everybody's got rich experience in this area. And I thought back to when I went to Iraq to launch the mission that Rose mentioned. So I had gone way back in 2004 to help launch the NATO training mission in Iraq, which did not work, and which then I went in to help close, and then now I have gone in to help start the new one. And when I met with the Iraqi delegation, my first question to them was, why didn't it work the last time? Why are we back here doing this again? And I'm sure it's a question you've all asked in your various functions. So that, as one example of many, I would say there are a few challenges that we can do better in meeting. I'll just put them to help stimulate the discussion. One is we need a stronger focus on institution building rather than only tactical training and equipping. And I think it's a trap we fall into over and over again. Long-term institution building. Second, better coherence between countries and better coherence between international organizations. We're all on our own stovepipes. We were just discussing that a second ago, and I'll give you some examples. Third, the broadest possible coalition, which offers political legitimacy as well as capacities. Fourth, we need more staying power, and those things obviously go together. Fifth, we need more interoperability between the various actors, military interoperability, political interoperability. And sixth, we need more in the way of a political strategy, not just a military strategy. And I'm not saying this to be critical of the military. I'm being critical of the political side, because my long experience at NATO is that the military is generally better able to define a strategy, more unified at coming up with proposals than the political side, and the military is always seeking a little bit more political guidance than we are able to offer. But as part of that, with better local knowledge about what we're actually dealing with. And I find over my years at NATO, and that's many, and then my years in the Canadian Defense Department before that, I'm bald, so you don't know how gray I am, but actually I'm pretty gray. We tend to go in with our own experience and we apply it to a situation which may not fit. So let me give you a few further thoughts on that. And I'll start with institution building. And don't worry, I won't take too long. I think this is an area where actually NATO has a lot to offer to the United States. And so I put that to you as something to look at most of all when we're looking at takeaways. If NATO's good at something in projecting stability, it is institution building, helping to design national security strategies, defense strategies, a defense ministry, chief of defense staff structure, and put in place the long-term training programs that are self-sustaining. These are things NATO knows how to do. And we have teams of people who know how to do it. And we can divide up the labor to do that, but do it in a coherent way. This is what, for example, NATO would offer in Libya. So NATO would not do tactical training. no intention of doing that. But this is what the Libyans have asked NATO to do because NATO knows how to do it and we have teams to do it. So I give you that as an area where NATO could be made use of by the US and by all the allies. Second, NATO is good at building very big coalitions, and we get staying power because of it. So we've been in Afghanistan for ages. There are now 39 countries in that mission, the Resolute Support mission, because it goes through NATO, and with one plan, civilian and military. So it has advantages. Of course, there are disadvantages. Once you're in, you're stuck, you're in. But it has advantages for those who are in because you get staying power and results. Coherence between allies. This is an area where we can do better. I want to be blunt about that. My experience in this field is nations do what they're going to do on a national basis. They are reluctant to share with other allies or partners what they're doing, even when it is obvious that we need a sort of coherent mapping process. I'll give a special forces example, one I'm sure you're familiar with, but the head of special forces of one of our Middle East and North African partners came up to me recently and said, can you help? Because there are 9 NATO countries providing special forces training. 4 of them or 5 of them want to offer it in exactly the same area. The others are not offering it necessarily in areas that I need, and they don't talk to each other. So could you please help? And we can't help, but it is clear that we need more transparency, what we used to call a clearinghouse in NATO, so that everybody shares what they're doing, and then we plug gaps and avoid duplication. And NATO is a good platform for this, and not just for allies, but for partners. In fact, the partners are willing to do it. It's the allies who are sometimes reluctant to do it. So I would put to you, use NATO for this. We're there, and we're a one-stop shop. And on occasion it does work, but it's difficult to consistently do. The Secretary General mentioned many of the other aspects I wanted to mention, but I do want to talk about the local knowledge and the political strategy. This is another area where I think we can and should do much better. My experience, again, to use the Libyan example, is I was sent in after the war to try to design for NATO a strategy, a strategic approach to what we should do. And I had not realized, many of you I'm sure had realized, but I had not realized until I went there that this was a Potemkin government. That yes, there was a defense ministry, but nobody really worked there. Yes, there was an army, but nobody really worked there either. In fact, nobody worked much even in the country because people were just being paid not to work. So these were fictional structures. But from outside, they looked real. And so when I went back to NATO with a certain approach, what I was told by many allies, speaking very openly, is no, we're going to do it the way we always did it in other countries. We're going to embed people here and embed people there. And then I said, yeah, but there is no there. I had just learned that. So we have a certain institutional way of functioning. And I think better local knowledge before we get engaged and as we get engaged is crucial for us to bring into our system. And we have just created what we call the Hub for the South in Naples that will add to our institutional understanding and knowledge as we get engaged, before we get engaged. We're also enhancing the consultation with partners so that we actually listen to them. And this was one of the decisions coming out of the summit. We met at the council level 31 times with partners last year, and much more below that. And we need to increase that. One other area, and then I will stop, where we can do better is to have one or a much more coordinated engagement with our partners. So I'll use Jordan as an example because we have a Jordanian colleague here. Jordan is what we call an enhanced opportunities partner with NATO, and we have so many programs of cooperation with Jordan. Our overall partnership program, then the defense capacity building program that Rose mentioned, then the enhanced opportunities partners, which I just mentioned, then the operational capabilities concept. So there's a whole military track, and then there's a whole civilian track. Now we're enhancing counterterrorism cooperation. The result is there's an unending stream of NATO people coming to Jordan, multiple programs of cooperation, which are not coherent. I would add to that, my own country, Canada, has its own bilateral cooperation, which is very substantial. The United States does as well. So I can only imagine how good this is for the airport and hotel and restaurant industry in Amman, but I can easily understand that this is not useful if you're Jordanian, and it is certainly not useful for us. So we in NATO are trying to we're using Jordan as a test case to see if we can, within NATO, come to one cooperation program with one review. And everybody goes together, does the review, everybody goes together and updates the program, and they don't have to deal with us all the time in a piecemeal way. I think we should do that more broadly as well, and use NATO as a way to have better coordination between the various engagements that we have with partners. Then one final point, and I will stop. Just to give you the big picture of what NATO is trying to do, so that you can imagine how you might fit into that. And I'll use the two strategic areas, which is Europe and the Middle East and North Africa. Rose gave the big picture. I would put it maybe slightly differently, but this is my own way of looking at it. When it comes to collective defense, NATO knows what it's doing, and we're doing that. When it comes to Russia, well, there's not much going on, but we know what we're doing, and we're doing that. What's at play is what's in between. There is an active Russian effort to destabilize many of these countries, and a military effort in Russia which is putting them at risk. So NATO is focusing, in essence, on three strategic areas. The Baltic Sea, and our cooperation with Sweden and Finland, very deep now. The Black Sea, as Russia has militarized Crimea and that region, we have been forced now to focus much more on that region, and we're doing it. And the third is the Western Balkans, which is more political and less military, and you've seen the latest moves when it comes, for example, to bringing new countries into NATO. So that's Europe. Ukraine and Georgia, of course, remain essential partners for us and major efforts of cooperation. Middle East and North Africa, there are three tracks. One is helping to deal with the crises themselves, and that starts with Iraq. NATO's not involved in Syria. Second is helping to prevent them from spreading, which means deeper cooperation with Jordan and Tunisia, in particular, defense capacity building programs. And third is to help build resilience, in particular against terrorism right across the region. And we're beefing up all of our cooperation programs, our political consultation, and with a particular focus on counterterrorism, with some special forces work, with some intel fusion work as well. These are niche in the Middle East and North Africa in particular. It is a smaller role than it is in Europe. There are big players in that region, US and others. We just want to fit in. I mean, to the overall jigsaw. But we do have particular capacities that we can bring to bear, and I will finish where I started. In particular, institution building, I think, is an area where NATO can add to your strategic interests in a cost-effective, sustainable, coherent, long-term way.
Wonderful way to get us thinking and started. Thank you. General, over to you.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. As I look across this audience, there are a lot of familiar faces here, so it's a pleasure to reconnect with many of you, although I have had to strike some of my remarks out because there's nothing that spoils a good war story like an eyewitness, and there are too many eyewitnesses here. I am, even though I'm appearing here obviously in uniform, I'm speaking from the current perspective I have, which is the Director of Strategy at the National Counterterrorism Center. And if you're wondering what that entails, it basically is captured in the name. I'm responsible for formulating counterterrorism strategies, not for any particular department or agency of the United States government. The responsibility of my organization is to create strategies for the entire United States government. An interesting proposition, to say the least. So even though I'm obviously military, I'm a Special Forces career officer, I'm not going to talk from the vantage of the Department of Defense here. And I want to acknowledge something, because everything I'm going to talk about in my brief remarks here is going to be about the problem of terrorism-related instability in Europe's or NATO's near abroad, and I actually tried to find a common definition of what Europe's near abroad is. I couldn't find one. So for the purposes of what I'm about to say, I'm defining it as a personal matter as the area of the Balkans, those portions of the Levant that are adjacent to the Mediterranean, the North African tier, and arguably some parts of West and Sub-Saharan Africa as well. So here goes. Particularly in the wake of another 9/11 commemoration, I think it is prudent for us and our allies abroad, particularly those in Europe, to take stock of where we are. There is a lot we should and can be proud of. Our ability as an international community, and certainly for those of us in the West, we have developed extraordinary ability and skill in dealing with terrorist plots, terrorist leaders, terrorist formations, and we should acknowledge that. We should be proud of it, and we should protect and continue to improve those abilities. However, that has not prevented the growth of terrorism. I don't think there is any conclusion one can come to when examining the distribution and the nature of terrorism around the world, including the near abroad of Europe, without coming to the conclusion that it's worse than it was. It's certainly much worse than it was on 9/11. That doesn't mean what we have done has been pointless or useless. It probably would be a lot worse. But terrorism, violent extremism across Europe's near abroad is worse today than it was more than a decade ago. And it is on a trajectory to get even worse. So with that happy news, let me dive into a few points, and then I'll try to wrap this up quickly. First of all, what has galvanized much of the international communities, including the attention of the United States and our European allies, has been the eruption of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria and its global expansion. There has been an extraordinary amount of military progress over the last 4 years in defeating the military component of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Extraordinary progress. Again, something that all the participating members of the coalition should and can be rightly proud of. However, there are still thousands of ISIS combatants across the Iraq-Syria landscape. And more importantly, our military progress in Iraq and Syria has not prevented the creation of what is now 8 declared ISIS franchises distributed around the world, including elements in Europe's near abroad, and as many or more undeclared franchises. So there is now a global Islamic State network that in many ways is larger and more capable than Al-Qaeda's network ever was. And our military progress in Iraq and Syria has not been able to prevent that. I just mentioned Al-Qaeda. We should not forget Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has not been the headline grabber it once was because of the emergence of the Islamic State, and Al-Qaeda has used that to its advantage, including in Europe's near abroad. The emergence of what we are now calling JNIM in Mali and that part of West Africa, the emergence of ISIS, the emergence of a very formidable Al-Qaeda presence in Syria, which obviously is part of Europe's near abroad, if you accept my previous definition. These are formidable ISIS franchises. Right now they are focused locally, but there is no reason to believe that Al-Qaeda has not forsaken its aspirations to attack the West. Matter of fact, there's ample reason to believe they continue to aspire to attack the West. As I think everyone in the room already knows, if one examines the capability and capacity of the countries of the Balkans, that part of the Levant that abuts the Mediterranean coast, the North African tier, West Africa, I think you'd be hard-pressed to identify a single country that has sufficient capability or sufficient capacity to deal with this growing problem, whether it's of the ISIS variety or of the Al-Qaeda variety. Now, I'm not suggesting that this entire enterprise is about to collapse. These terrorists are not perfect. These terrorist movements are not superhuman. But the problem is growing, and I don't think you can identify one country, at least I can't identify a single country that has sufficient capability or capacity to deal with a growing problem. If that weren't bad enough, the nature of terrorism is changing. What I mean by that, not the nature, the character of terrorism is changing is probably a better way of describing this. And I'll give you 3 examples. If one had asked me several years ago, what is the typical method by which a new terrorist is created? My answer would have been, well, it usually is a result of a face-to-face effort between a potential recruit and a terrorist recruiter in a community, in a religious environment, in a neighborhood, somewhere around the world. And as a result of that personal interaction, face-to-face interaction, that person becomes a terrorist. That is no longer true. The creation, and ISIS has been the pioneer in this, the creation of online radicalization and mobilization of violence is the way of the future. Thousands of terrorists are being created without any face-to-face contact whatsoever. This has been a bonanza for terrorist recruiters because you don't have to make the physical, fiscal, or security investment necessary to create a new terrorist. You simply have to communicate with them online, and some of you are probably aware of this. This is an Al-Qaeda example. Anwar al-Awlaki, who's been dead for years, is successfully recruiting terrorists today. Secondly, if someone had asked me years ago, how does a terrorist create the ability, the physical ability, to conduct an act of mayhem somewhere in the world, including in Europe? My answer would have been it requires central planning, centralized direction, centralized resourcing, and some form of command and control. Again, this is no longer true. This is not my answer today. ISIS, again, is the pioneer here. And we're seeing this play out in Europe's near abroad, and unfortunately, we're seeing this play out on the European landmass as well. It begins with the ISIS mantra of stay where you are, use what you have, kill who you can. It's important to remember that truck driver in Nice several years ago killed as many people with his van as a large-scale IED would kill. That required no training. That required no provision of resources. That required no central direction. That is the way of terrorism in the future. And then finally, as if this weren't bad enough, as technology becomes both more affordable and more powerful, the ability of a terrorist somewhere in the world to create very lethal effects is becoming stronger and stronger. And one needn't look no farther than the emergence, and again here ISIS was the pioneer, but everybody's learning from ISIS. ISIS' ability to use cheap, affordable, commercially available unmanned aerial system technology as a combat weapon is the way terrorists are going to fight in the future. And if you're wondering how powerful this technology is becoming, I'll use unmanned aerial systems as my example. The fastest quadcopter you can buy with a credit card today and have in 3 days anywhere in the world is pushing 200 miles an hour. You can buy with your credit card jet engine unmanned aerial system. These coming out of the racing and sporting world. They are flying in excess of 400 miles an hour. Imagine what a terrorist can do with that. And this is totally unregulated. This is only an example of how increasingly powerful technology can and will be turned to nefarious purposes. Okay, so what's the answer? In my view, and as we try to formulate strategies, we are trying to embed this view in the strategies we submit to policymakers. While we can and should preserve, and where we can strengthen our ability to attack terrorists, either to disrupt an imminent plot, or to remove a resource, or to remove a leader, where the entire international community, and I would argue Europe as well, should increasingly look toward is what kinds of investments should be made to prevent the creation of new terrorists. The creation of a new terrorist is not prevented by a hellfire strike. The creation of a new terrorist is not prevented by a precision raid. Those things are necessary, but that's not how you prevent the growth of terrorism. If we've proven anything for the last 17 years, I think we have proven that. Okay, let me close by making just one comment. I know there's a lot of talk in this town and around the world that, particularly we in the West, we've got bigger problems, and I acknowledge that. Whether it is Russian behavior or other forms of peer-to-peer competition that we have to care more about, I get that. But I just urge one note of caution, and perhaps I'm biased because of the job I'm in, so I'll mangle an old quote. We may be less interested in terrorism, but terrorists are still interested in us. Thank you.
Thank you, General Nagata. Well said. Mr. Mitchell, over to you, sir.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Like General Nagata, a lot of familiar faces in the room, and my thanks to AUSA and PKSOI for sponsoring this. I have a very personal interest in stabilization. Unlike General Nagata, I'll tell you a quick war story. As a young Special Forces major in Mazar-i-Sharif in 2001, we had repaired the airfield after the liberation. And our colleagues in the Northern Alliance decided to form a police force in Mazar-i-Sharif consisting of 200 members from each of their militias. And they wanted to have a common uniform so that they would be recognized not as various ethnic groups, but as a nonpartisan police force. And they asked us for if we could purchase uniforms for them. We ran it up our chain of command and we're told, no, we can't use Title X funds to buy police uniforms. We talked to our CIA colleagues and the CIA came back and said, no, we can't use our Title 50 funds to buy police uniforms. We asked the State Department and they said, well, we could use Title 22, but Afghanistan's still under sanctions, so we can't provide the uniforms. And the very next day, as we were still wading through the bureaucracy, on our newly repaired airfield, a C-130 landed unannounced. It was an Iranian C-130. And the next day, all those policemen were wearing brand new Iranian-provided uniforms. And our bureaucracy, had prevented us from doing something that would have been not only very helpful to stabilize in the area, but would have bolstered our relationship with them. So we're penny wise, pound foolish. So from a personal perspective, the idea of stabilization in conflict areas is very important to me. It's also very important to SOLIC. It's one of the many responsibilities that we have in ASD SOLIC, and it's important for us to support this endeavor. So as NATO moves into this third phase, from collective defense to projecting stability, can't leave one behind. They need to be able to do both. So as the U.S. and NATO work to address these parallel challenges and competing priorities, I want to talk a little bit about the Stabilization Assistance Review. Some of you may have read it already. Some of you may have seen copies out there. It was published this summer, and if you hadn't had a chance to read it, I'd recommend it to you because I think the methodology there that's discussed in that review will help our NATO partners and strengthen the alliance and building new partnerships, an important part of our new national defense strategy. So we have taken our years of hard lessons learned in Iraq and Afghanistan and come to the conclusion that the Department of Defense, we cannot do stabilization on our own. We really need to work with our state and USAID partners to ensure both unity of effort and ensure that we're all working towards common goals. So the 3 Ds, defense, development, and diplomacy, worked over many months last year to author this document. Believe it or not, just like kind of the near abroad definition that General Nagata mentioned, we did not have an approved definition of stabilization in what it meant in the United States government. And so they worked on that and came up with that definition. I'll give it to you in a second. But the SAR was then signed by the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and the Administrator of USAID, which I think in and of itself was, for our interagency bureaucracy, was a big victory. So I'll read the definition to you because I think it's important to get it right. It is a political endeavor involving the integrated civilian military process to create conditions where locally legitimate authorities and systems can peaceably manage conflict and prevent a resurgence of violence. Transitional in nature, stabilization may include efforts to establish civil security, provide access to dispute resolution, deliver targeted basic services, and establish a foundation for the return of displaced people and longer-term development. We think that's a great definition. It touches on many of the themes that my colleagues on the panel have already touched on. And in addition to providing that definition, the Stabilization Assistance Review also identified the various roles that different agencies within the United States government will play. So State Department is the lead federal agency for stabilization. USAID is the lead implementing agency for stabilization, and the Department of Defense is in the lead for supporting and providing security. So a couple of steps that we're taking right now within the Department of Defense to institutionalize this. We are revising one of our DoD instructions on support to stabilization. It's currently with a DepSecDef for signature. We're working with our colleagues in state and USAID on a global memorandum of agreement on how we will implement this on the battlefield. And we've set up a legislative proposal to give the Department of Defense the authority to actually conduct limited stabilization. So in situations like that in Mazar-i-Sharif, that we would have been able to take some of our defense-wide operations and maintenance funding to spend for those uniforms. Unfortunately, it didn't make it through the legislative process and into this year's NDAA, but we're pushing it forward again in the next year. Again, because we don't have that authority to conduct it. But the SAR framework is playing out right now in Northeast Syria. I think this is a great success story, if one that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. We have partnered with USAID and state for the Syria Transition Assistance Response Team, START. It's headquartered in Ankara with USAID and state running it. We have a DoD Army Civil Affairs officer is there. And then on the ground in Northeast Syria, we, the Department of Defense, are providing security and mobility for our USAID counterparts. So they can go out and meet with their implementing partners. They can actually get to these locations that they otherwise would not be able to get to and assess the situation, prioritize, and disperse money. And we're now, since President Trump last year suspended U.S. funding, they're now dispersing funds from other members of the coalition. Honestly, I think it's a great model, one that I wish we had worked upon earlier. It involved us not only having to give special training to soldiers. We had to work with the diplomatic security at the State Department to train the soldiers to make sure they met the diplomatic security standards and the vehicles. But it's been very, very successful. So as we move forward, I think there's some key lessons that we can talk about and questions for NATO as they look at focusing on and projecting stability. The first thing I think is NATO needs to expand their partnerships beyond just the NATO members, and in some cases they're already doing that, to build resiliency within these partnerships and operational capacity, particularly in the defense institution building. I cannot say strongly enough how much I support the idea that we need to build sustainable institutions, and we do frequently fall back on tactical training because it's easy, relatively easy, it's measurable. We can, give some statistics, whereas institution building is always a little bit more messy, not least of which because it involves the host nation politics, and it can get very contentious. But I think it's really important to make sure our partners are able to managing their own security. I think NATO needs to learn how to leverage the civ-mil integration. There is no, to my knowledge, a straight USAID type counterpart on the political side in NATO that is charged with working with the implementing partners. So NATO's going to need to develop those relationships. And as was also mentioned, improving interoperability. That was a big challenge for us with our state and AID partners in Syria, but we've come a long way and we're folding those lessons into that global MOA. Lastly, a couple key questions for NATO as they move forward. How's NATO going to develop the criteria for stabilization engagement and prioritization where they're going to do it? What authority and funding will NATO use to conduct these stabilization activities? What sort of relationships will NATO develop outside NATO with other non-governmental organizations and implementing partners and other diplomatic organizations? And how will NATO work with other multilateral bodies in the stabilization space? So for 70 years, NATO has done a fabulous job of providing collective security to its members. But now as we move forward and again into this third phase, they're going to have to be able to do not only the collective security, but projecting stability. And we look forward to working with our NATO partners to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. General Hickman?
It's great to be here with you here today, up from Norfolk, Virginia, with the Supreme Allied Command Transformation. The NATO Strategic Command is in North America. So I'm speaking here as a NATO officer with the U.S. to my right and James here. It's good that we're kind of balancing off this panel here as we look at what NATO's doing. I'm going to, as briefly stated at the beginning, I'm going to talk about a couple of documents that ACT, Allied Command Transformation, publishes. And then look at the concept or some ideas about protecting stability from the strategic command level. The first one is the strategic FourSided Analysis. I tested this last week. If you go into Bing or Google and type in strategic FourSided Analysis, this is the first document that will come up, at least on my desk. It's unclassified. It was published last year. We'll do regional reports in 2019 at the four different regional reports. So it's an ongoing process, but looking out to 2035 and beyond. So I'm talking about the future today. The second document is the Framework for Future Alliance Operations. This just takes the foresight of looking out and describing the type NATO forces, the alliance, what the alliance needs to accomplish all three core tasks, and also with our partners. And this is a by-a-seat document. So SACUR and SAC-T both with ACT in the lead and writing it, but it's closely coordinated and written with SHAPE. And so both strategic commanders signed this document. And this is really their best military advice to the alliance, to NATO headquarters, and to the alliance as we go forward looking in the future and how we need to transform NATO. There are also the two documents that lead the NATO defense planning process that look out to the future, the targets, the type forces that NATO needs across the alliance, again, with our partners to conduct the three core tasks, and of course, deterrence, defense, protection, stability, when we're here today. So the SFA, the FourSided Analysis, it looks at 5 themes and many trends and implications. And I'm not going to go over all those, but I'll highlight a few of them as we look to the future and the type and protection stability as we're talking about today. But it would cover all the tasks that NATO does. Those themes are political, the human, the technology, the economics, and the environment. And so I'll highlight a few of those. But really, as we look to the flanks, the 360-degree approach that NATO takes to security of the alliance, it apply to many different areas. But the idea of these is not just one of them. It's not just the environment. It's not just the social impact on a region or a country or an area outside the flanks of NATO. It's the confluence of those trends where they come together, where there maybe is climate change that affects the economy, that has a social impact that brings instability to a government. And in there you have a stability or instability situations that may be occurring. And you can look at different areas across the world and see that occurring today. So that's one of the major ideas. The political, we're looking at a redistribution of military and economic power as it goes across from Europe, the United States, North America, and other parts of the world. It looks at the power politics between the major powers and how the major powers then affect stability in the regions that surround NATO in 360 degrees. And it looks at public discontent leading to polarization. These are just a few of them. There are many other areas in the political. The report also talks about the aging population and the urbanization of societies and the effects that's having on instability in our regions. It talks about technology that General Nagata gave one great example, but how technology is changing and continuing to move rapidly forward. And really what the idea that we've all observed, though, is the traditional R&D process where governments used to drive technology, of course, is not occurring today. Now it's independent actors. It's non-state actors that are driving technology changes around the world and how that's being used. The economy, the increased inequality across many different nations, within different regions, and also the competition for resources. And the environment, I talked about that. So the SFA, the FourSided Analysis, then looks across these, and it lays out the challenges that are facing NATO, the instability of those different regions I'll talk about in the next report. But it also talks about the alliance and how the alliance needs to maintain its cohesion as we move forward, build trust across the alliance, trust with our partners as we then go out and face these instability situations. The second document then is the Framework for Future Alliance Operations. And this again is a BIC document that SAC-UR and SAC-T both signed in just in the spring of this year. It is the best military advice and the characteristics of our forces. They can go out in these to face some of the challenges that were discussed to the gentleman to my right. It talks about the nature of war, as many have said, is not really changing. It's still a contest of wills. It's about honor and interest. It's about driven by fear. The natures maintains the same. But the character of armed conflict continues to change with the technology advances, concepts, the different domains, all these different things coming in and changing how a war is going to be fought in the future and how it's being fought today. We talk about the strategic context. As NATO goes forward here, the context is, again, discussed to the gentleman to the right. James really talked about the context that's changing. But we have to strengthen our deterrence, defense, and projection stability, and realize all three of those go together. Projection stability is coherent with deterrent defense of NATO as we go on our core task. And the last thing of this last couple things of this part, then we lay out the instability situations and that NATO is going to be facing in the future. And there's 16 we described. That was probably not everything, but it lays out all the way from a WMD or a conventional type war, all the way down through terrorism, cyber challenges, all the way to natural man-made disasters. And so it really lays out how these, what our troops, what the alliance is going to be expected to face in the future as we go forward here. And coming out of this is in the central idea. What type forces, what type units do we need to be successful in this type of environment, this complex environment that's ever changing? And we laid out some ideas about units that have to be able to evolve, to be able to operate in this complex environment. They have to adapt and be innovative to be able to operate in these environments. And they have to be credible, networked, agile, and resilient. So the big idea coming out of that, we have to maintain as we go forward here, our interoperability of our units as we go forward. And there is a concern as nations become more technologically advanced that NATO maintains the interoperability between our forces, but also our partner nations as we go forward, and not just in conducting deterrence defense, but our projection stability operations, as already stated. The Deputy Secretary General talked a lot about Afghanistan, of course, but Iraq as we go forward in other places and with our other partners here. So the last part on this document here is in the implications, and that's what's really important as we go forward here. What are the implications of NATO to be able to operate in this type of environment? Well, we have to have forces that are prepared. And you saw a lot of that discussion that came out of the summit declaration about the readiness initiative of NATO to make sure our forces are prepared when needed to accomplish the mission. They have to be able to project our combat power from either North America or from different parts of Europe, whether it's inside NATO boundaries or outside conducting operations and crisis management operations. They have to be able to engage. Engage means be able to accomplish our task, whether it's defending NATO or interacting in a crisis situation. And of course, the last two or three, we have to sustain, protect, and consult ourselves, command and control ourselves as we go forward here. So the last thing I will bring up then is we bring these two documents, and again, I encourage you to look at them because they are from the two strategic commands and the strategic commanders, is where we look in the approach then we take for projecting stability. And there is coherence between deterrence, defense, and projecting stability. They all go together. They all support each other as we go forward here. I mean, NATO is a defensive alliance set up in 1949 to defend NATO in North America. But Europe and North America. But it has evolved over time as the threat and the challenges have evolved over time. So protecting stability then is clearly focused on the three core tasks, or crisis management, cooperative security, and collective defense. It does have stability, where we want to have capable institutions, resilient societies that are on the boundaries in other parts of the world that NATO operates in with our partners. And as James said, is what our partners need, what their goals are, their objectives. So we're working in concert with our partners. But projecting stability then in the military stance from the strategic commanders is those proactive activities that are linked together though for coherent outputs that support the political military objectives that NATO has, but also the political objectives that nation needs as you work in concert as one partner. It's important that we work with the international organizations, the EU being a critical one as we go forward here with the capabilities the European Union has in certain parts of the world that NATO has more resources than NATO has. And it also needs to look at a regional context. And that's really where, from ACT's perspective, we're looking now as we've looked at the overall foresight. Now we're looking at different regions, looking 5 to 10 years out and what the goals and objectives are, at least from the strategic military commands level. And as we provide the commander then provides military advice to the NATO headquarters, to the nations. And the last couple of things that has to come out of this is the comprehensive approach. This is not a military approach. The military is in support primarily, normally, and other times in the lead with NATO operations as we go out with our partner nations and look for those goals that the nations want. And so I think I'll stop there and then I'll open up for questions.
Thank you, General Hickman. So we've reached the Q&A section of our panel. While you guys are getting organized and starting to think about your questions, maybe I'd use the prerogative of the chair here just to get your thoughts on, how you view projecting stability and how can that mitigate against hybrid threats. I heard reference to resilience and prevention, the role of the EU, partners, engagement. How do you see it kind of unfolding? So against today's hybrid threats, and maybe more also in terms of future threats. Any takers? James?
Thanks. I'll start, but I'm sure there's plenty to follow. And obviously, we look at this every day, and so do our partners, and our partners engage with us on a regular basis with their experiences as well. So let me just maybe mention 3 or 4 things. First, one of the things we need to do with our partners is listen to them, because they experience this sometimes full force and before we did. And I note we have Georgians and Ukrainians here who are unfortunately extremely experienced with this, but they're not the only ones. So we have a regular dialogue to try to learn from each other. Second, we need to identify what are the areas where hybrid attacks require, or hybrid threats require, greater resilience, and beef up our defenses against them. So one area, for example, is cyber defense. All of our countries are experiencing regular cyber attacks. So we have set up a center of excellence for that, and we have regular consultations with our partners with them, and we have a division that works with them to beef up their capacities. Another area is strategic communications. Again, clearly something we all feel. Again, we have set up a center of excellence. Again, we work with our partners. We help them build up their capacity. So, for example, in Ukraine and in Georgia, we have experts deployed there, big teams of people, including Stratcom experts, who are working with the ministries there, so that we can beef up capacity to defend against that. Then a third area, which is not necessarily for us, is pressure using energy supplies. That's more for the European Union, of course, than for us. Then there is the full spectrum of military activities, because often I think we make the mistake in NATO of seeing hybrid as what comes below the threshold of military activity. But actually it isn't that. It is full spectrum. And it includes covert military activities and then overt military activities. So one of the areas which we all need to beef up is intelligence, early warning, strategic awareness. And knowing what's happening, but also crucially being able to attribute what's happening. One of the challenges of hybrid attacks is that it is designed to be ambiguous, difficult to detect, or deniable. And so being able to attribute things clearly is a capacity that we need to build, because if you don't have attribution, you don't unlock the responsive action. And getting consensus in NATO at 29 or hopefully soon 30 to do something together requires a pretty high standard of attribution, which means we all have to be able to have better intelligence and to share it better. And sharing intelligence is something that I think all of our communities need to work on better, because the intelligence world, as you all know, is a sort of exclusive community which sets its own rules, including for sharing information. And there's always a good reason, but the net result sometimes is we don't know what we should know on the policy side, and we're not able to act because information is so carefully guarded that it's not shared. So this is another area where we could do a lot more with our partners, building up their capacities, but also sharing information with them and from them, so that we're able to act together. And then the final point is on the European Union. Nothing has driven NATO-EU cooperation more than the need to build resilience, both in our member countries and also with our partners, in the face of post-2014 hybrid threats to the European body of nations. When I started at NATO, I was told not to be seen with a friend who works at the EU to have lunch. I mean, he just plays on my hockey team. It's a Swedish guy. And then I came back and like, oh, somebody saw you having lunch. I say, yes, I was having lunch. And they, no. Things are totally changed. And we are working with the EU, coming to projecting stability, more and more with partner countries to map out what each is doing, to coordinate what we're doing to the maximum extent possible. And we have a pilot project now. So in Europe, that works quite well. We haven't been able to do that as well in the Middle East and North Africa, but now we have a country where both organizations are heavily engaged, and our teams are now working together to map out what each is doing. So we're getting better at doing it, but this is absolutely one area where we need greater collaboration.
If only we had somebody that could speak to the intelligence side of some of these questions. But General Nagata, I would like, not just to limit yourself to that, but the overall.
Yeah, didn't we solve the intelligence sharing problem already? I must have missed the memo. Information sharing continues to be. I think one can factually state that information sharing across the international community or within any particular government is better than it once was.
And especially at NATO.
But that's the wrong question. The wrong question is, it sufficient? And there the answer is inarguably no. And as the complexity of the national security challenges we face, including an increasingly complex terrorism problem, the requirement for information sharing doesn't remain static. The requirement is actually rising. So even as we arguably make progress at information or intelligence sharing, the goal line keeps moving away from us. And sometimes I think we fail to recognize that. I do want to say one thing about the term projecting stability. And I don't mean this as a critique. I just think it's a necessary caution. and I'm going to restrict my comments here only to terrorism-related instability. I think if we've proven anything in the last 17 years, certainly within the U.S. government, I would argue we've proven this, and I think it applies internationally. It applies to NATO countries as well. We can project help for the creation of stability, but only the people who live there are going to create durable stability. Now, we can create transitory stability by projecting a lot of power, but it'll only last so long as we project that power and those resources. Only the locals can create permanent or durable stability, but their journey is inevitably slow, halting, laden with setbacks, and often taxes our strategic patience. So we in the West in particular have a tendency to react with listen, just get out of the way and let me do this for you, because this is taking too long. That's a road to fleeting transitory stability at best. Secondly, pick a place, pick Mali or Egypt or any one of the Balkan states. Their ability to create stability against the terrorist threat is connected to their neighbors' ability to create stability. They can create an island of stability within their own country, and it will fail because of instability that comes across its borders in other locations that did not create stability. So this is an incredibly complex problem, and it cannot be solved by simply creating stability against violent extremism in one place. If you don't look across the borders to the problem of instability, terrorist-related instability in the adjacent nations, you're going to be proud of what you've accomplished, the locals will be proud of what they accomplished, but it won't last.
Thank you, sir. Mark, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, just back on the discussion of hybrid threats, and I think both James and General Nagata kind of hit on some of the same issues, but I want to go back to the definition that we had for stability, and it's locally legitimate authorities and systems. And I think to the degree that we have the right political military partnerships and that strategic patience to work at that local level is really important to building that resilience against those hybrid threats. We tend to focus a lot at the nation state level, but in a lot of these areas, the threats are very localized. And frankly, if the institutions, particularly the civilian institutions, the police and the governance and everything else, were functioning properly, they would be much stronger and better able to resist some of these efforts. And again, those are the types of development that take a dedicated, long-term, civilian-led political effort to establish.
Thank you, Mark. General Hickman, thoughts?
Just a couple I would say one of the things we're doing, the Strategic Command is working on, is the lessons learned centers in Lisbon. They work this closely to bring in the lessons learned from the hybrid threat and how different nations and NATO as a whole has reacted to this, are been proactive against these threats, and also with our partners. And through the exercise program that SACUR runs with our partner nations, looking at a hybrid threat, not just, and I know Sir JFC Brunson, sir, you're here maybe this afternoon, more about that. We got the experts in the room with us here that work those things. I would just say the measurement of effects, the regional approach, as General Nagata was talking about there, that's really part of the restructuring of the strategic commands and how to look the mid to long term. So it's not a short-term approach to these regions. Is really one of the big ideas that came out of the NATO command structure adaptation, the structure adaptation as we go forward here. So we are looking long-term, the strategic commands are, and the effects of our actions, not just in a specific country, but across a region as we go forward here.
Thank you, sir. Let's now open it up for questions. So we have a couple here. Just a reminder, please introduce yourself and let us know where you're from. Thanks. So we have one right here. No, let's go here and then to the back, please.
Thank you. My question is going to be to Mr. Appathurai. I'm Lieutenant General retired Ben Hodges from Center for European Policy Analysis. The question is going to be about NATO's coherence in the Black Sea region and expansion, specifically Georgia. But to give you a second, I'll come back to the question. I want to say about Bill Hickman, I'm glad that the Army continues to provide quality general officers to fill this position at ACT. We don't have as many general officers that have European experience anymore, that understand the alliance and those relationships with and understand our European allies. So Bill, having the Army putting a quality guy like you there is important, and I hope the Army will continue to fill that. All right, so Jim, I gave you a couple minutes there to, but I was very happy at the summit this summer when Secretary General Stoltenberg made a more firm comment about Georgia becoming a member of the alliance, but still it remains open-ended. And so it still feels like we're allowing Russia to veto who comes into the alliance or not. And in my view, the Black Sea region is probably more important to Russia than is the Baltic Sea. And so getting the right coherence in the alliance, with what we started in the Baltic region, extending that to the Black Sea region, what's the alliance going to do to increase that coherence to be able to counter Russian aggression there? And also with, I think, expanding east-west commerce, Georgia is going to become even more important for everybody. So making sure that it is secure. Russia still has 10,000 troops occupying 20% of Georgia 10 years after they signed an agreement saying that they would leave. They clearly have no intention of leaving. So I think we should be serious about getting Georgia into the alliance. Thanks.
Thanks for that. First, it's good to hear there was an American happy at the summit, but that's. Coming to your question, yeah, I mean, I share personally much of what you've said with regard to Georgia, but let me say this. First, the Black Sea is now quickly moving back up the NATO agenda, and for the reasons that I mentioned, and that is when Russia annexed Crimea, it moved a lot of high-end military equipment into the region and has now destabilized, the whole area, and we've seen they've used that as a platform for operations into Syria. And there's a larger question, I think, which we should all be looking at, which is the growing sort of Russian presence right around the Eastern Mediterranean, bases in Syria, attempting to get influence in Egypt, even into Libya. So it's something to watch, not just from a projecting stability point of view. The specific case of Georgia is very central to NATO, and that's the reason why at the summit we had the first ever head to state and government level meeting with the Georgian president as well as with the Ukrainian president. In terms of the Black Sea, the region, the coherence is growing now. We're having plans developed, setting up military structures, having more military presence, certainly having more analysis and focus on the region as a region. So I think that's happening. When it comes to Georgia, the foundation is very strong, as you know very well. I use the line more NATO in Georgia and more Georgia in NATO, and both of those things is happening, but certainly there is no country outside of NATO where NATO is more present in terms of personnel, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of exercises, in terms of political presence, in terms of visits. And the Deputy Secretary General Rose will soon be going, and I'll follow. And so there's really a lot going on. And the Allies really are committed to Georgia. But there isn't consensus on moving Georgia into NATO. And that's just the way it is. That doesn't relate to Georgia's level of readiness as much as it does to larger political questions. But these are not illegitimate questions. As you know, the process of membership for NATO requires that NATO is ready, that the partner is ready, but also that enlargement contributes to wider Euro-Atlantic security. And there are allies who do not yet feel that this would be the case. They feel that it would introduce, moving forward politically on the membership track for Georgia, they are concerned that it would raise risk for Georgia from Russia, let's be blunt, without yet providing the security guarantees that they are able yet or willing to provide. And in that circumstance, when we don't have the consensus to move forward politically, what they're focusing on is deepening our presence there, providing more equipment, providing more capacity building and institutional reform. And as you know, for example, one of the NATO governments has just decided to provide missiles, defensive missile systems, anti-tank. Another country is going to provide them training. We're working on counter-mobility training for them. So this is real stuff. Also working with their Coast Guard to enhance security in the Black Sea. An exercise that will take place next year. So you can really see that the NATO presence continues to grow. My own feeling, now I'll give my personal feeling, is it may not be for tomorrow that Georgia enters NATO. And I do think, like you, that it's important to keep reminding our political leadership of the regional role that Georgia plays. Sometimes we look at Georgia like an island, but its role as a transit country for energy, for goods, its important influence in the region, which is contested, the region is contested, is something that I'm not sure all of our political leaders always remember, and I try to remind them. But I sometimes look at the Baltic states, and maybe it won't take that long, but they kept the faith, and we kept the faith, and didn't give up on the political goal, and they made it in. So however long it will take, this is a worthy goal. The allies are committed to it. The political circumstances have to be right, and Georgia has to be ready. We're working on the things we can control, which is Georgia has to be ready, and that's what we're helping them to do, and they're leading on this, and successfully. And hopefully sooner rather than later, the politics fall into place as well.
Would the other panelists like to, any comments? Okay, great. I think we had another question, please.
Yes, I'm Lieutenant Commander Mike Nunziato, a U.S. Navy Foreign Area Officer. Been at the hub for the South for about 19 months now. Questions for both James Appathurai and Major General Hickman. With regards to what you see as the hub's role in projecting stability, as you see it as part of that clearinghouse you mentioned before, or part of the predict and prevent aspect of early warning, just like to get your take on that. Thank you.
Well, I'll start out. The hub has got a critical piece as we look at the framework for the South, and it is a organization that works for, obviously, for SACEUR for up to SHAPE. But ACT does have 3 positions that we put it into the hub because, really, I think the one area I'm going to cover is the situational awareness, the understanding and expertise of the hub focused down to the South. And sir, I know you're going to talk this afternoon. We have the JFC Naples Chief of Staff here with us who oversees the hub's activities every day. But for us, the situational awareness is we do look out mid to long term and what NATO's operations are, but also the situation there is what the countries to the south are doing and how NATO interacts with our partner nations in those areas, but also other nations where there could be opportunities for protection stability type activities as we go forward here.
Just a quick word. The hub is finding its way. I think that's fair. That's why you asked the question. But it's finding its way, I think, already in the right direction. And that is we're already now building the ties between the hub and the rest of the NATO family. What is important first and foremost from us is that the hub is integrated into what NATO as an organization is doing. Otherwise, it's not useful for the hub and it's not useful for us. So we've taken steps very recently, I think in particular, to really build those ties. For me, now I speak personally, 2 areas where I see that the hub can really add value to NATO is on the strategic early warning, because the hub is engaging with a number of actors on a systematic basis with which we don't always interact, meaning the academic community, having partners embedded in the hub also really helps, working with NGOs. So the hub may well get early warning that we don't have and can feed that into the overall body. And the second area, which is where I discussed with you a little bit before, is getting an overview of what people are doing, the mapping role. This is, to me, a gigantic shortfall in the way the international community engages with partners. The inability to have an overview of what everyone is doing is, to me, absolutely striking. It is a lesson we never learn. And the reasons are not only because we don't learn. We do learn, but there are political reasons why countries don't want to share. But the reluctance to share information about what they're doing means there is gigantic duplication, big gaps, waste of resources. And I'm hoping that the hub for its area of responsibility where NATO is engaged, can enhance our role in, can enhance NATO's overview of what everyone's doing so that we can plug in a useful way.
Thank you both. Other questions? Let's see, we have one in the back, and then we'll go up here. Okay, please.
Thank you, gentlemen. Lieutenant Commander Nick Kessler, Navy Reservist. I'm actually supporting General Hickman down there at NATO ACT. General Nagata, you outlined as far as terrorism, sir, has actually gotten worse here since 9/11. And actually, Mr. Mitchell, your background outlined essentially how that loss of opportunity, really economic and social opportunity, kind of exacerbates that. So my question really goes towards even General Mattis's comments there, kind of abbreviated as far as that supporting non-kinetic means, to increase stability. And if we don't, we need to give them more bullets. So along that, I'd curious as to y'all's thoughts on how we can actually build non-military and business capacity and capability associated here with the partnerships that we're looking to build in order to be able to provide hope and opportunity back into these regions that we're actually trying to project stability into. Because we know we can't, we need a business, not a bullets approach in order to win hearts and minds, if you will, over the long term here. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. It's one of my favorite topics, but I'll try to be brief nonetheless. I'll give you my glib answer first, and then I'll give you my more serious answer. My glib answer when it comes to any government, whether it's our own, our allies and partners, becoming better at preventing the creation of new terrorists, the other non-kinetic, non-military forms of dealing with terrorism. Reminds me a little bit of the fashion advice I get from my wife every time I emerge from our closet, having selected what I think is appropriate for the evening, and she looks at me and she says, "Will you go back in there and just try?" That's my glib answer. We have to try harder. One of the functions I perform on an annual basis, and this is specific to the U.S. government, but I think it's instructive. We actually try to examine the apportionment of resources between kinetic means for dealing with terrorism and non-kinetic means, non-kinetic means. I doubt it will surprise anybody in this room that a very tiny fraction of our resources go to contesting terrorism through non-military and non-kinetic means. We have to redress that imbalance. We have to shift some of our investments to the non-kinetic world, or we're never going to be as good at these things as we need to be. Now, I'm not suggesting that, military scale or DoD scale budgets need to be apportioned to these things. Let me give you some quick examples of what I'm talking about. Preventing terrorist travel, denying the availability of resources. Typically we call this counter-finance, but it's more than money. It's other forms of resources that terrorists must have to operate. Contesting their increasingly effective activities on the internet. Fighting their narrative, fighting their ideology. Much of this is happening online these days as well. And then just helping local actors prevent their neighbors, their family members, their communities from taking the path to radicalization and mobilization of violence. None of these things can absorb the billions or even trillions of dollars that have typically been invested in military campaigns. But they need some resources. And my own judgment is nowhere around the world is the investment of resources for these non-kinetic capabilities adequate to the challenge that we now face. And as I alluded to earlier, we've proven we can kill terrorists in very large numbers. We've proven anything in the last 17 years, we've proven that. But that has not prevented the growth of terrorism. So doing more of that is probably not the road to strategic success. After 17 years, it hasn't solved the problem. It is time, in my judgment, to shift a modest investment, really pennies on the dollar, to these other forms of contesting terrorism.
Got a couple of thoughts here to build on. What I want to talk about is what we're doing on some of these areas from the perspective of the Department of Defense. The first one is I want to talk about. Some of you may be familiar with it, Operation Gallant Phoenix. It is an international effort hosted by the Department of Defense in Jordan, and where we bring, I think we're up to about 25 partner nations, and also several international organizations like Interpol that bring information about terrorist threats there so that we can fuse it, share it, exchange it with each other, and prevent terrorist travel, and turn it over to law enforcement agencies in these various countries to prevent terrorist attacks. It's been very effective, and as James was talking about the need for information sharing within NATO and the EU, be happy to talk a little bit later offline about what I think is at the heart of the of Gallant Phoenix, and it's SunNet. It's a sensitive, unclassified network that started out as an experimental effort, but allows us to give access to partners and allies, and to exchange information, to analyze social media, and to perform a bunch of other information gathering functions using publicly available information. And it's proved tremendously successful. One of the other things we're doing is the Global Messaging and Counter-Messaging Center. It's currently housed at the U.S. Central Command down in Tampa, Florida. And they are online battling the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda day in, day out. We're expanding that effort to include the other combatant commands, and we'll be moving later this year over to, it'll be housed at U.S. SOCOM. The combatant commands will retain responsibility for the messaging and counter-messaging within their respective AORs, but SOCOM will provide the infrastructure and some of the specialists at helping them get that message out there, and also push back against the extremist message. We're also supporting the Global Engagement Center at the State Department. We had there was a provision in last year's NDAA that allowed the Department of Defense to provide up to $60 million out of defense-wide O&M to support the Global Engagement Center. It's a long, sordid story, and I don't want to bore you with it, but bottom line, we've had some challenges on the Hill, but I think we're about to push it over the finish line this week and transfer $20 million. That was all the defense committees would let us do. But as a consequence of that, we've said, hey, if we're going to fund it, we'd like a voice in it. And again, it's another non-kinetic solution to engagement, and we're going to focus on specifically the counter-Russian effort, which I think is very important. And the last piece, General Nagata touched on it, the counter-threat finance. Again, amongst the basket of responsibilities that SOLIC has, one of them is counter-threat finance for the Department of Defense. And as part of that, out of actually our counter-narcotics funding, we support fusion cells, the URIFC, and there's another one in Europe that take information from law enforcement and from the military, and again apply it to these destabilizing efforts of narcotics trafficking, human trafficking, etc. So we play a large role. We have about $800 million a year in our annual counter-narcotics budget, and a significant portion of that goes to supporting our law enforcement partners across the globe. So there are some of these things going on. We need to do a better job of again, integrating our stovepipes and making sure that we've got unity of effort in these areas.
I'll jump on this a little bit outside my lane, but slightly still in with counterterrorism really being a national focus. NATO has a part of this, but the nations are work to counterterrorism within each nation and our partners. But I would tell you, as you look back, the kinetic versus non-kinetic is the measure of effectiveness. I think we have to do a better job at the classified level and the unclassified level to explain the effectiveness of the non-kinetic piece and how it affects the mid to long-term approach we go. I would throw that out there. And then, of course, since we got the War College here and the piece here, I mean, what we're all talking about, to state the obvious, is extremely complex. What General Nagata was talking about, I understand this. And it's not something you just learn if it's your first job. I mean, we have to build leaders in the military and also on the civilian side of our government and other organizations that study this for their entire career. I don't think you can bounce around the world like we used to and expect to be able to understand the Middle East or other parts of the world and then bounce around to the other side of the world and understand another near-peer threat or emerging threat and then go back to it a few years later. When you read the book Mastery by Robert Greene, I mean, he's talking about wisdom here, not just an understanding of the threat.
Sorry, I had a thought, so I'm just going to add it, but I put it to you because we can't do it, but Americans can do everything. So I put it to you. One of the experiences I've had is and this flows from what you just said, Bill, is that we have no capacity to retain expertise and lessons. So when I went to Libya, I thought, okay, this is a country that doesn't have institutions. Let's go get the people who went to Afghanistan at the very beginning when they didn't have institutions, and the people who went to Iraq when their institutions collapsed. Different example. So I said, great, who was it who went in before NATO in Afghanistan? We don't know who they are. The United States didn't know who they were. Where are they? We don't know where they are. Where are the lessons that they wrote down about how to build? We don't have them. Not just the US, NATO didn't have them. Nobody has them. We don't keep track of the people who do this. So every time we go into a new place, we have to find new people who haven't done it before, who might have done it somewhere else that was different. We don't keep a record of them. We don't keep a proper lessons learned function internationally for this. Maybe individual, I mean, the Army's great at lessons learned, I know that, but from a broader, comprehensive, first of all, Canadian government point of view, maybe whole of government American, I don't know, but certainly international, we don't have that. So setting up a roster, keeping a roster, not setting up a roster, just keeping a roster of who the experts are, what they've done, where they are now, and being able to tap them and bring them back when you face an immediate crisis would be a huge improvement. And it is a mechanical process that can be performed by an institution or a government that sets up a structure to do it in a UN context or in another context. So I just put that to you. We're not the place that can do it. NATO is not the place to do that, but I would suggest it needs to be done. So I just leave that with the group.
Okay, now I can't resist sharing a war story. A friend of mine once asked me, after we'd come out of a very frustrated process, if I knew what a learning organization was. And I said, well, I think I do, but what's your definition? He said, a learning organization is any organization that demonstrates its ability to repeat its mistakes perfectly.
In response to James' comments, I just want to say I think it's a great opportunity to talk up the PKSOI and our Peacekeeping Stability Operations Institute here in the Department of Defense and the Army is I think a great example of how at least we within the Army try and institutionalize and maintain a sense of what's happened before, so we're not repeating those same mistakes perfectly, maybe imperfectly, but that's and I think maybe a similar type organization focused on this with our civilian counterparts, both at state and aid, to look, again, the whole stabilization assistance review was precisely done for that reason, because we had not, as a government, captured all of those lessons learned and looked at it collectively from our different perspectives. And now 17 years on into this conflict, so we're getting there one step at a time. Maybe we can help our NATO partners do something similar.
Well, thanks. I'm definitely going to take that definition of learning organization right into some of the leadership classes we do at the War College. We had a question back here?
Hello, everyone. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Morehouse, J5 Africa, U.S. Marine Corps. Fantastic panel. It's been a pleasure to be here. So many great points been brought up. And to hear your thoughts echoed along with what we're thinking is fantastic. So this question is really in the focus of projecting peace and stability. And as I thought through the question, as I heard you all speak, I thought, fantastic point. You made the question for me. Is to Mr. Appathurai, I'm going to screw this up. You mentioned strategic communications, big piece. Also we're repeating a lot of the same mistakes over again. And to General Hickman, you said, it's fantastic right at the end. You said, we can't stay in one place, leave, and then come back. Unfortunately, we've seen in our national strategic doctrine, national defense strategy, military strategy, where a lot of our resources are being repostured, are structuring. We're leaving the continent of Africa specifically in many ways. Are we essentially leaving just a bucket of water for an Olympic-sized pool? Are we about to re-engage with the same current conditions that we'll face 10 years from now because we've repostured, and we're going to start to see an influx of third-party actors come in, China, Russia, essentially take our place. And that's our biggest concern, most specifically from what we do as action officers. Thank you.
So I'll touch on this. I'll try to tread carefully. I think most of you have seen in the newspapers that there are some discussions underway within the Department of Defense to restructure our posture on the ground in Africa, particularly with respect to our counterterrorism efforts. I don't want to get in front of the Secretary and his decision, but I'll at least tell you the arguments that we have made from the policy perspective on the civilian side, and that we've encouraged our counterparts in the Joint Staff to look more broadly at our counterterrorism efforts in China or in Africa, and view them not strictly through a counterterrorism lens, but more of a broader lens of the peacetime competition against the Russians and Chinese. And we've pointed out that particularly in Africa, in the security cooperation realm, is one area that I think the United States have an overwhelming advantage against the Chinese and the Russians. The vast majority of countries in Africa that are currently working with us would prefer to keep working with the United States in the security realm rather than working with China or Russia. The Chinese, in particular, are making massive economic investments, and their military investments are beginning to expand. And the point that we've made is, look, wherever we vacate, the Russians and the Chinese will be glad to step in. The other part is that for most of the countries where we're conducting counterterrorism efforts, that's the main threat that these nations face, and that's the type of assistance that they specifically want. And from my perspective, where we sit in SOLIC, we see this as a very low-cost, high-return effort there in Africa. So we've encouraged them to not move too quickly to shut down our CT efforts, and again, look at them through a broader lens and make sure that we're not walking away from something that several years from now we're going to regret, and having lost influence with those countries to the Russians and Chinese.
Let me add something from the counterterrorism point of view. As Mark's already alluded to, there's a lot of conversation about what our intentions regarding Africa are going to be. I'm talking about the United States government here, but there's not been a lot of decisions so far. So I personally don't really know what our trajectory is going to be at this point. But in the venues that I participate in, which obviously are counterterrorism venues, what I typically try to offer my interagency and White House colleagues is what I'll offer you here, and that is our interest, the West's interest in terrorism or the trends of terrorism in Africa have at least two major components, has at least two major components. The first is, obviously, we have our own security, economic, and other forms of interests on the African continent. So we care to the degree we have interests at stake in places like North Africa, for example. But that's only half of the, that's only at best half of the equation. The other half is what I tried to suggest in my opening remarks, which is that this is part of Europe's near abroad, and terrorism in North Africa, in the Levant, in the Balkans is a threat to NATO, is a threat to the European Union, is a threat to the member states of the European continent. And we obviously have an abiding security, economic, diplomatic, et cetera, interest in the stability of Europe. Now, I think the high watermark of terrorism attacks recently was in 2016. There was something like 140 terrorist attacks of one form or another among European Union states. That's numerically, that's not a lot. But the point of terrorism, as we all learn in school, is not to cause casualties. The objective of terrorism is to compel political change that would otherwise not happen. And the political consequences of terrorism in the near abroad, in Europe itself, directly affect both European as well as American interests. So if we do make a decision to do less, whether it's in Africa or elsewhere, what we should have done is the strategic calculation that we are willing to absorb what will almost certainly happen. Is that wherever, and that we've proven this over and over again, wherever we reduce our pressure on terrorist movements, the terrorism problem becomes worse. So as long as we've thought that through and said, yep, that's a price we're willing to pay, so be it. But again, we've not made a decision on this yet.
Thanks. A quick point on what they were addressing. I would say you're absolutely right, and I think Mark kind of went straight at this. Russia and China are engaging in Africa now as a political strategy, and they are applying military and economic partnership agreements as part of a political strategy. So it would be important for any government to not just exclusively look at the area of cooperation through the effect that it has on a tactical basis, but also recognize that it is part of the implementation of a long-term political strategy, which is exactly what I know everyone does, but sometimes we don't do it enough. When it comes to, but on that subject, one of the advantages that NATO has and has for its member states is that we have partnership agreements. We've just celebrated 20 years of partnership with our Middle East and North African partners, with annual or now biannual partnership agreements with agreed areas of cooperation. Every one of them includes counterterrorism. We hadn't beefed it up much in the past, now we are, but these countries have a long-term standing relationship with us and through us with our member states. They know us, we cycle through there, we're helping them to reform their ministries according to the high standards of NATO countries. We're helping them set the curricula in their defense education establishments for the next 20 years. Their officers are being trained according to a NATO standard curriculum, and by the way, including courses on our systems and what we're like. They're training with us. So this is an opportunity for allies to have not ad hoc up and down relationships with partners depending on a specific area of cooperation that might be more important or less important at a particular moment, but over time, and it is consistent. So I would just, again, encourage all allies to use NATO for the political advantage and the staying power that we provide. When it comes to strategic communications, this is obviously of growing interest to all of us. We need to be better at detecting the activities of outside actors and responding to it, but it is absolutely the case that it has to be the host government that takes action. It cannot be NATO. I was NATO spokesman for 7 years. I can't effectively communicate to Estonians or or Swedes. It has to be their government. But we can help build capacity where we have that ability, and we're doing that. It is important to note that you can't just build capacity in the government. The media also has to be trained to detect fake news and not be susceptible to it. Often they are. The Russians in particular are very sophisticated in the way in which they communicate now. I think we all know that. They micro-target individual communities. They don't use the sort of old-fashioned message that, oh, NATO is bad, or, they say your government is corrupt. The EU is ineffective. You won't be able to send your kids to school in your language, et cetera, et cetera. It's very targeted, very effective, and therefore we need to be much more sophisticated in responding, and we need to train the populations. So my kids have instant access to everything. They don't go to the library. I mentioned going to the library. They laughed their heads off. This confirmed all their suspicions that I was old, which was made worse last week when I got a FaceTime call and put it up to my ear. And so I just hadn't seen that it was FaceTime, but this is for them like the ultimate hilarity. But all this to say, they have access to information. The challenge is not getting information. The challenge is knowing what's good and what's not good and sorting it. So once a week in school in Belgium, they get training on how to know what you're getting is good information. And everybody needs that training. There's a whole host of other things that need to be done, and they need to be done by governments, but we really need to have a very multifaceted approach to this. Micro-targeted and a lot of resilience, starting with government, then the media, don't forget the media, and the populations. And just to close, I was just in Skopje a few days ago as they prepare for their referendum on the name issue, and met with a number of journalists. That's why I was there. And they all told me the same thing, which was over the last 10 years, the media corps has been decimated because of activities of the previous government. They lack numbers, they lack expertise, they don't know how to do, or many of them now are feeling that the media corps is weak. And as a result, they're very susceptible to or the country is susceptible to disinformation. So national programs, and I know the US has them, to help build up professional media corps in partner countries is a strong contribution to their resilience and to their democracy.
Any other questions? Yes, we have one right here.
Thank you very much, Major Prokop from NATO HQ Cooperative Security Division. I would like to introduce my question by replying to what Mr. Mitchell said earlier. He asked about the kinds of partnerships NATO builds, and I think even though we do not promote that, we already have a certain variety of partnerships that evolved. The first type of partnership I would describe as enabling partners to become future NATO members. The second type would be very focused on interoperability to enable partners to take part in NATO-led operation and crisis management operations. And the third type of partnership is fairly new, and it is about supporting partner nations to find a solution to their problems that is sustainable for them. That might include interoperability, but not necessarily. So my question is basically about the third type of partnership. And when we speak about projecting stability, it is about giving resources for an interim solution. We provide this country resources, and they become to a certain extent dependent on that. And having a 14-year-old son, he mirrors myself when I was a teenager. And I remember well when my mother told me that I have to learn to do my own laundry. I told her, yeah, I can do that, but it's much more comfortable for me, and it's much more efficient if you do it for me, because you do it anyway. I do not want to offend any partner nations, but I think we face a similar problem here. And this is a part of the whole conversation that I miss in projecting stability. And since I'm German, I could not put down the microphone without referring to Clausewitz. He told us we always have to think about the last step before we take the first. So what actually could be incentives for partner nations to become independent again from not only bilateral programs, but also from NATO programs when we think about projecting stability. Is there any thought on the American national level on such incentives? I would be very interested in that. Thank you very much.
It's no surprise to anybody here that, especially now under President Trump, the United States pays a very close attention to those resources that are going to other countries. I think I would say that, the problem you described, the free rider issue, and then countries becoming dependent on us is something that we always have to think about. I mean, Linda Robinson, a good friend of mine from RAND, wrote a book several years ago, How Does This End?, about our involvement in Iraq. And it is this, and this honestly is a challenge I think we're still facing in Syria, is we haven't defined a long-term sustainable political solution to the problem and work towards that. And so without being too critical, I think we've unfortunately been making some of our strategy at the tactical level, and it's a challenge anytime you get involved militarily to define that end state. But we do consider it, and to the best of our ability, we look to wean our host nation counterparts and our partners off our support, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully. And again, as we look at Africa and in changing the nature of our posture there, that's been one of the questions that's been asked is, how long is long enough, to get them there? Same question keeps coming up, frankly, with Iraq and Afghanistan, Yemen, almost everywhere where the United States involved. We do look at that. I wish we did a better job, had a better crystal ball and could wean them off more quickly. But again, this goes back to the institution building and the long-term commitment. And sometimes we're talking decades rather than just years.
I'm going to offer one thing, which is an old topic, but I think it's one that we, particularly Western countries, I'll just restrict it to the United States, we often take our eye off of too soon, and that is to help the partner we're seeking to help. In other words, someone else's government, to realize they are part of the problem. The way they interact with their own population is part of the problem. And that our willing, and again, this is not original thought. I've seen us do this. It's just too often been transitory. And that is a difficult conversation with that government, that our willingness to help you is tied to your willingness to change how you relate with your own people. But that is a really difficult conversation. Identifying success is even harder, and it takes an incredibly long time. And what I often see happen is that we lose patience with that approach. And the approach collapses, not because of opposition by the host nation government or the people of that country, but we run out of patience.
Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, Steve. Great questions. And there's lots of answers. I would just offer three thoughts. First is that we are a pot of resources, like a gigantic golden goose. So I want to come back to the point that I made about coordinating. What is quite clear is that countries that are seeking international support create these gigantic lists of what they need, which they legitimately need in most cases, but then they give the same list to everybody, hoping to get something. And in the end, get lots and lots of some things and not enough of other things. So I think it's, even at the very early stage, very, very important that the international community coordinates their response to what the government is asking for. We don't do that. So that's an easy win, and we don't do it. Second is the matter of corruption, which is huge. And I think we would have to, as an international community, insist on reforms in the governments, to improve transparency, to give parliaments a stronger role in overseeing defense spending, defense budgets, the appointment of ministries. Some of the things that we have in our building integrity program. To me, it should be a sine qua non that if you're getting international support, you're also adopting a program to decorrupt your government. And we know what the program is. We have one. 20 NATO countries have, or 20 countries, NATO and partner, have gone through it, including Norway, the most uncorrupt country you can find, where everyone's tax return is published online so your neighbors can see how much you earned. Even they did it. So if they can do it, anyone can do it. But I would say that should be something we automatically do. Then the third thing, and this comes to the non-resource aspects, is designing, having them design what follows. In other words, and I'll come back to a Libya example. What happened with Libya was the institution collapsed, and then a number of NATO countries and also the UN went to them with really good plans for how their defense apparatus and security apparatus should be structured. Did the analysis, super quality people said, this is what you should do. It didn't stick because they didn't feel engaged in it, and it wasn't tailored to the very complicated politics of that country. We have a process in NATO, and I have nothing to do with that, so I'm not, blowing my own horn. But we have a defense planning process, which is just a series of questions. It asks the right questions. And when you answer, then they look at that answer, they say, okay, then the next thing you need to ask yourself is this. And then the next thing you need to ask yourself is that. And then at the end, the country involved feels like it designed its own program, but with expert support, and they're part of it. So I think this is another intellectual way we need to approach these things, not to come with our very good Ferrari solutions, BMW solutions, but let them design a Yugo. Like if it's a Yugo, but it runs, let them design their own Yugo, and then they can run it on their own and not always need a hybrid, technician, hybrid in the electric gas sense to run it, because sometimes we design things they just can't run on their own.
I just say that we used to refer to that as trying to give the Ewoks the Death Star. They don't really need it, don't know how to use it, can't sustain it, and so you have to be very careful about that.
I'll just throw two quick ideas out there. Really, the question before yours and yours, incentives, the approach to the South. I think NATO needs to continue to work, and James mentioned it, one NATO, all the NATO nations working together. So if we're going to pull out of, and I don't want to speak for the U.S., I don't know the strategy in Africa, but if the U.S. is looking at resources, our different nations are, not just the United States, how well we efficiently use the resources of all the nations together becomes even more important. So that's one point. The second point I would bring up is to yours on senators. So I would say always look in the mirror before I try to at least look in the mirror first, critique myself before you critique the other person. And so I think we need to look in the mirror about the senators when we work in these very complex environments. So I would argue that in June of 2015 there was no doubt that the coalition was going to beat ISIS in Iraq. Even when Ramadi fell and the Iraqi army withdrew quickly and left all their gear behind. So if it's a given, you're going to win. The ISIS of 2015, it's morphed into another ISIS. So I'm talking about the 2015 ISIS to 2017. So if it's a given, you're going to win. There was a given we were going to win in Iraq, the coalition with our Iraqi partners. Then how you win becomes more important than winning, because it's already given you're going to win. So how you win is more important than winning. And so that's the long-term approach that I keep talking about. That's why I think the ACT's part, from the strategic command's perspective, to look mid to long term. How you winning becomes more important than winning. If it's a given, you're going to win.
We're out of time, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least offer an opportunity for either a final thought. Particularly, is there something we really need to do right now that is a priority or is there something that we really need to talk about that we didn't bring up today? So final thoughts?
Well, okay, thanks for that. I'll offer one last personal reflection. So none of this is NATO policy, and that won't be on the website. I think one thing that has struck me for years and years in stability operations of whatever kind is and I'm very blunt here, a slight tendency to look for the positive in what we're doing rather than having bluntly honest assessments of where we're not having a strategic effect. And that we tend to, and NATO does this too, tend to look at individual tactical progress and lose sight of the fact that on a strategic level, maybe we're not moving as fast as we can because we want to believe that we're having an effect, and we are having an effect. So I don't know exactly how to define it, but I do think one area in which our community needs to improve is in assessment, in being very brutal with ourselves, telling our political leaders very brutally that, strategically it may not be going the way we think it's going. So that's my sort of, the thing that haunts me all the time is I'm not convinced. I feel like we slightly want to fool ourselves sometimes. We never fool other people, it's not that we tell untruths, but that we so want to be having an effect that our assessment process of the strategic effect isn't as honest with ourselves as it should or could be. So that's, I don't know, we can have a long discussion about it, but if I leave one thought with you, if I leave one thought with myself, where I really don't think we've gripped it, it's that.
Just one thought, which in a way already came up today, one or two examples of where we were unable to make a decision quickly enough and we paid a strategic price for it, but I'll synthesize it down to basically one statement. If we as an alliance, if we as a country don't get faster, the world is not waiting for us to get faster. Our adversaries, whether they are terrorist adversaries or other forms of adversaries, they're not taking a break waiting for us to pick up our speed or pick up our tempo of making decisions and accepting the risks of going more rapidly. And we are ceding the strategic landscape to adversaries, including terrorist adversaries, that are willing to make decisions and implement them very, very rapidly. The gap that I think I see as a strategist between the West's ability to go from thought to decision to action is basically, if it's changing at a glacial pace. That is not true of any of our adversaries. Now, we can tell ourselves we're stronger than any of these adversaries, but if you're too slow to act, the advantage your strength gives you dissipates very, very rapidly.
Just want to, as a final thought, emphasize the fundamental nature of stability and stabilization as a political effort. I think the vast majority of people in this room are in uniform or from defense organizations, and while we play an important role, we really have to embrace the civilian side, bring them in, work closely with them to achieve that long-term political stabilization. Thanks.
My last comment, what I've learned over the last year, having only served in NATO, in Afghanistan, more at the tactical level, is at the strategic level, the power of 29. You can't be overstated. Most U.S. officers don't serve in NATO, at least in the Army. But when you get into NATO and you understand the power of 29, and when 29 nations do decide to do something, it is extremely powerful. And some of the smaller nations don't have the same resources as the larger nations, but they still bring a capability that can be matched from the larger nations. And so I would encourage our U.S. As you go out and at your level to as you engage your NATO partners and our alliance and our partner nations, that you understand the strength of that. So it's not the U.S. and NATO doing this. NATO is doing this. The U.S. is part of NATO. Thank you.
Thank you for that final word. Please join me in thanking our distinguished guests.